The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet suburban streets as 17-year-old Zara carefully navigated her father's midnight blue BMW through the tree-lined neighborhood. She had just finished her shift at the community center where she tutored younger kids in math and reading. Her backpack sat in the passenger seat, stuffed with homework she planned to tackle once she got home. Zara loved driving her dad's car, not because it was expensive or flashy, but because it still smelled like his cologne and reminded her of all the times he'd picked her up from school events when he was home between deployments. The leather seats held memories of their weekend, drives when he'd quiz her on everything from world history to her college plans. She was only 3 blocks from home when she noticed the police car behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Police patrolled this neighborhood regularly. But when the red and blue lights started flashing, her heart sank. She pulled over carefully, just like her father had taught her during their practice driving sessions. Officer Rodriguez stepped out of his patrol car with the kind of swagger that came from 2 decades of police work. He'd been patrolling these streets since before Zara was born, and he thought he knew every type of person who belonged here and who didn't. When he saw the young black woman behind the wheel of a car that probably cost more than most people made in a year, his suspicions were already forming. Zara rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, exactly as her father had instructed her years ago during one of their serious conversations about staying safe during police encounters. She watched in the side mirror as the officer approached, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "License and registration," Officer Rodriguez said without any greeting or explanation for the stop. "Yes, sir," Zara replied politely, reaching slowly for her purse. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "Just get your documents out." Zara handed over her license and the registration from the glove compartment. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "Here you go, officer." Officer Rodriguez barely glanced at the paperwork before looking back at her with obvious skepticism. "This your car?" "It's my father's car, sir. I'm heading home from work." "Work?" The officer's tone suggested he found this hard to believe. "What kind of work does a kid like you do that lets you drive around in a car like this?" Zara felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice respectful. "I work at the Riverside Community Center. I tutor children after school and help with their homework programs." Officer Rodriguez let out a short laugh. "Community center, huh? That pay enough to afford a BMW?" "No, sir. Like I said, it's my father's car. He lets me use it sometimes when he's away." "Away where?" The questions came rapid fire now, each one carrying more suspicion than the last. "He's in the military, sir. He's currently stationed at Fort Carson." This seemed to amuse the officer even more. "Oh, so your daddy's a soldier? What's he do? Work in the kitchen?" Zara bit her tongue, feeling anger rise in her chest. "No, sir. He's a colonel in special operations." Officer Rodriguez actually chuckled at this, shaking his head as if he'd heard the most ridiculous lie of his career. "Special operations? Really? Let me guess, he's some kind of Navy SEAL too?" "Army Special Forces, sir." Right. "And suppose he's out there saving the world while you're joyriding in his fancy car." Zara's voice remained steady despite the humiliation washing over her. "I'm not joyriding, sir. I'm coming home from work. You can call the community center if you'd like to verify." But Officer Rodriguez was no longer listening to her explanations. He was looking at the car with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for crime scenes. The pristine interior, the expensive sound system, the military base parking sticker on the windshield that he'd somehow overlooked. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded suddenly. "Sir, may I ask what I've done wrong?" I said, "Step out of the vehicle, now!" Zara unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door slowly. As she stood beside the car, she noticed a few neighbors had come out of their houses. Mrs. Chen from across the street was watering her garden, but clearly watching the scene unfold. Mr. Thompson had stopped mowing his lawn and was leaning on his mower, observing with obvious curiosity. Officer Rodriguez began walking around the BMW, peering into the windows as if expecting to find evidence of some crime. "So tell me again about this father of yours, the one who's supposedly some big-shot military man." "Colonel David Mitchell, sir. He serves with the 5th Special Forces Group." "Mitchell?" The officer looked back at her license. "Your name's Johnson." "My parents are divorced, sir." "I kept my mother's name." Officer Rodriguez nodded as if this explained everything. "Ah, so Mommy got the kid and Daddy got stuck paying for the fancy car. That makes more sense." Zara felt tears of frustration building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She'd watched her father maintain his composure in difficult situations countless times, and she drew on that strength now. "Officer, if you could just call my father, he can verify everything. His number is in my phone." "Your phone's going to stay right where it is for now," Rodriguez replied, continuing his inspection of the vehicle. "We're going to figure out exactly how a teenage girl ends up driving a car worth more than most people's houses." By now, more neighbors had gathered. Zara could hear whispered conversations and saw people pointing in her direction. The shame was overwhelming, but beneath it was a growing anger at the unfairness of the situation. She thought about all the times she'd driven through this same neighborhood without incident when her father was with her. How different things were when a decorated military officer sat in the passenger seat. Officer Rodriguez radioed for backup, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Need a unit for backup on Maple Street. Got a suspicious person in a potentially stolen vehicle. Occupant claims the car belongs to her military father, but something doesn't add up here." "Sir, the registration clearly shows the car belongs to Colonel David Mitchell," Zara said, her voice slightly louder now, despite her efforts to stay calm. "Anyone can get fake registration, sweetheart. You'd be surprised what people try to pull these days." The word sweetheart stung worse than any of his previous comments. Zara had worked hard to be seen as mature and responsible. She maintained a 4.2 GPA, volunteered regularly, and had already been accepted to several colleges. But none of that mattered to this officer who had already decided what kind of person she was based on the color of her skin and her age. A second patrol car arrived, and Officer Rodriguez's partner, Officer Walsh, got out and approached the scene. Rodriguez immediately began sharing his version of events, speaking as if Zara wasn't standing right there. "Got a young lady here claims this BMW belongs to her father, who's supposedly some high-ranking military officer. Story keeps changing, and something just doesn't smell right about the whole situation." Officer Walsh looked at Zara, then at the car, then back at his partner. "Did you run the plates?" "About to do that now. But I'm telling you, something's off here. Kids don't just drive around in cars like this unless something shady's going on." Zara watched as more neighbors gathered, some taking pictures with their phones. She thought about her father, probably in a meeting or training session, completely unaware that his daughter was being humiliated in their own neighborhood. She thought about her mother, who would be furious when she found out what had happened. And she thought about all the other young people who had faced similar situations without a father whose credentials could eventually command respect. The afternoon that had started so normally with her helping kids with their homework and looking forward to a quiet evening at home, had turned into a public spectacle. And the worst part was knowing that no matter how this ended, the neighbors would remember seeing her detained by police, and some would always wonder if maybe there had been some truth to the officer's suspicions. As Officer Rodriguez continued his radio communications and began running her license plate number, Zara stood quietly beside her father's car, maintaining the dignity he had taught her, and waiting for this nightmare to end. The license plate check came back clean, but Officer Rodriguez seemed determined to find something wrong. He handed Zara's documents to his partner while continuing to circle the BMW like a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. The afternoon sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the street where more neighbors had gathered to watch the unfolding drama. "Registration's clean," Officer Walsh reported quietly to his partner. "Cars legally registered to a Colonel David Mitchell at the Fort Carson address." But instead of ending the stop, Officer Rodriguez raised his voice even louder, making sure everyone within earshot could hear him. "Well, well, well. So the car is registered to someone named Mitchell, but here we have Miss Johnson claiming it's her father's vehicle. Funny how that works, isn't it?" Zara felt her stomach drop. She'd explained the name difference already, but the officer was clearly using it to justify his continued harassment. "Sir, I told you my parents are divorced. I kept my mother's surname when they separated. That's why the names don't match." "Sure, that's what you said," Rodriguez replied with a smirk. "But you know what? People say a lot of things when they're caught red-handed. Maybe this Colonel Mitchell is your boyfriend? Maybe you took his car without asking? Maybe he doesn't even know it's missing yet?" The suggestion that she was some kind of car thief or involved with an older man made Zara's face burn with embarrassment. Several teenagers from the neighborhood had joined the crowd of onlookers, including some kids she recognized from school. She could already imagine how this story would spread through social media and the hallways of Jefferson High School. "Officer, please," Zara said, her voice starting to crack despite her efforts to stay strong. "Just call my father. He's probably still at the base. He can verify everything in 2 minutes." "Your phone stays where it is," Rodriguez declared dramatically, pulling out his own phone and holding it up. "But you know what? I think I will make a call. Let's see what Fort Carson has to say about this Colonel Mitchell character." Zara watched with growing horror as the officer made a show of dialing information for the military base. But instead of asking to speak with her father directly, he began speaking to whoever answered the phone like he was conducting a criminal investigation. "Yes, this is Officer Rodriguez with the Metro Police Department. I need to verify the identity of someone claiming to be a Colonel David Mitchell with your Special Forces unit. We have a situation here involving a possible vehicle theft. Vehicle A. Theft." The words hit Zara like a punch to the stomach. This officer was actually suggesting to the military base that she had stolen her own father's car. She thought about her father's reputation, his years of dedicated service, and how this phone call might affect him. "What's that? You need his service number?" Rodriguez looked at Zara with mock politeness. "Do you happen to know your daddy's service number, sweetheart?" Zara did know it. She'd memorized it years ago along with other important family information. But something in the officer's tone made her hesitate. It felt like a trap. Like no matter what she said, he would find a way to use it against her. I know it. But maybe you should speak with him directly instead of, "Oh, now you're trying to tell me how to do my job?" Rodriguez interrupted, his voice getting louder. "First you're joyriding in stolen cars, now you're giving orders to police officers? Officer Walsh shifted uncomfortably beside his partner. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. But Rodriguez was the senior officer and Walsh was still relatively new to the department. He'd learned to follow his partner's lead, even when he had doubts. The crowd was growing larger. Now, Mrs. Peterson from down the street had come out with her 2 young children, who stared wide-eyed at the scene. Mr. Franklin was recording everything on his phone, though Zara couldn't tell if he was documenting police misconduct or gathering evidence of what he assumed was her criminal activity. "You know what I think?" Rodriguez announced to the gathering crowd, as if they were all part of some community meeting. "I think we've got ourselves a classic case here. Young girl sees an expensive car, maybe at a parking lot or a restaurant, figures out a way to get the keys, and then makes up some elaborate story about military fathers when she gets caught." "That's not true!" Zara's voice cracked as she spoke, tears finally starting to form in her eyes. "This is my father's car. I've been driving it for months. Ask any of these neighbors. They've seen me before." But Rodriguez was on a roll now, energized by his growing audience. "Oh, I'm sure you've been driving it for months. That's how these things work. You steal a car, you keep using it until someone catches you. The question is, how many other cars have you taken?" The accusation was so outrageous that Zara actually gasped. "Other cars? Officer, I'm an honor student. I volunteer at the community center. I've never stolen anything in my life." "Honor student?" Rodriguez laughed, and a few people in the crowd chuckled along with him. "Honey, half the criminals I arrest claim to be honor students. The other half claim to be victims of mistaken identity. You're hitting all the classic talking points." Officer Walsh cleared his throat. "Maybe we should just—" "What we should do," Rodriguez cut him off, "is search this vehicle thoroughly. If this girl is telling the truth, she won't mind us taking a look around for any evidence that might clear this whole thing up." Zara's heart pounded as she watched Officer Rodriguez open the driver's side door and begin going through the car's interior. He pulled out her backpack and dumped the contents onto the hood of the car. Her textbooks, notebooks, pens, and a few personal items scattered across the metal surface. "Let's see what we have here," he announced, picking up one of her notebooks. "AP Chemistry, AP History. Well, someone's been doing their homework, but you know what? Criminals go to school too." He continued rifling through her belongings, examining each item as if it might contain evidence of some grand conspiracy. When he found her community center employee ID badge, he held it up triumphantly. "Look at this, folks. A very official-looking ID card. Course, you can make these things on any computer these days. Probably trying to establish some kind of fake identity to go with the stolen car story." "That's real," Zara protested. "Call the community center. Ask them about me. I work there every Tuesday and Thursday." But Rodriguez was already moving on to the next item, her college acceptance letters that she'd been carrying around since receiving them last week. She'd been so proud of getting into 3 different universities, and now this officer was treating them like evidence of criminal activity. "College acceptance letters," he announced to the crowd. "Very impressive. But here's the thing about criminals. They're often pretty smart. Smart enough to forge documents, create fake identities, and come up with believable cover stories." One of the neighbors, a woman Zara didn't recognize, spoke up from the crowd. "Officer, are you sure about all this? I mean, she seems like a nice young lady." Rodriguez turned toward the woman with obvious irritation. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's exactly what criminals count on. They count on people thinking they seem nice. That's how they get away with it for so long." The phone call to Fort Carson had ended several minutes ago, but Rodriguez hadn't shared the results with anyone. Zara wondered what they had told him, whether they had confirmed her father's identity and position. and why the officer was still treating her like a criminal if the military had verified her story. "Officer," she said quietly, trying one more time. "What did they say when you called the base? Did they confirm my father's identity?" Rodriguez looked at her with what could only be described as glee. "Oh, they confirmed that there is indeed a Colonel David Mitchell stationed there. But here's the thing, sweetie. That doesn't prove you're his daughter. That doesn't prove you have permission to drive this car. For all we know, you could have looked up his name online and used it for your story." The logic was so twisted that Zara felt dizzy. No matter what evidence supported her story, this officer found a way to dismiss it or use it against her. She thought about all the conversations she'd had with her father about systemic injustice, about how some people would always see her as suspicious no matter what she accomplished or how she behaved. The crowd had grown to nearly 20 people, now including several of her classmates who had stopped to watch on their way home from school. Zara could see them whispering to each other, some recording videos on their phones. By tomorrow, everyone at Jefferson High would know about this incident, and she knew how quickly rumors spread and facts got distorted. "Please," she whispered, no longer caring if her voice showed how scared and humiliated she felt. "Please just call my father. Let me talk to him. This is all a misunderstanding." But Officer Rodriguez was enjoying himself too much to end the show now. He had an audience, a young woman who couldn't fight back, and all the authority he needed to keep the situation going as long as he wanted. The sound of heavy boots on pavement cut through Officer Rodriguez's latest theory about fake college documents. Every head in the growing crowd turned toward the approaching footsteps, but none faster than Zara's. She knew that purposeful stride, that commanding presence that seemed to change the energy of any space he entered. Colonel David Mitchell appeared around the corner of Maple Street like a force of nature. Even from 50 yards away, his military bearing was unmistakable. The perfectly pressed Army combat uniform, the confident posture, the way he moved with absolute certainty toward the scene unfolding around his daughter and his car. Several neighbors who had been casually watching suddenly stood straighter, unconsciously responding to the aura of authority that preceded him. "Dad?" Zara whispered, relief flooding through her voice as tears finally began to fall freely down her cheeks. Officer Rodriguez was in the middle of explaining to his growing audience how sophisticated modern car theft rings operated when the colonel's voice rang out across the street like a command that brooked no argument. "Officer, step away from my daughter immediately." The effect was instantaneous and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phone cameras that had been recording the humiliation of a teenage girl suddenly swiveled to capture this new development. Officer Rodriguez actually took a step backward before catching himself, his face cycling through confusion, irritation, and the first hints of concern. Colonel Mitchell covered the remaining distance in long, measured strides. Up close, the full impact of his presence became clear. The uniform wasn't just pressed, it was immaculate. The insignia on his collar caught the late afternoon sunlight. The Special Forces tab on his left shoulder seemed to glow. But more than any of the visual details was the way he carried himself, like someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions and having those decisions followed without question. "I said step away from my daughter," the colonel repeated, his voice level but carrying an edge that made everyone within earshot pay attention. "Now." Officer Rodriguez tried to recover his authoritative demeanor, but something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic. "Sir, I'm conducting a police investigation. Here, I'm going to need you to stay back while we—" You're going to need to explain why my daughter is standing on a public street in tears while you rifle through her personal belongings," Colonel Mitchell interrupted, his gaze moving from the officer to the contents of Zara's backpack scattered across the hood of his BMW. "And you're going to explain it right now." The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the youngest children seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Mrs. Chen had stopped pretending to water her plants and was openly staring. The teenagers who had been joking and recording videos were now watching with wide eyes, probably never having seen an adult command such immediate respect and attention. Officer Rodriguez attempted to regain control of the situation. "Sir, your daughter was driving a vehicle that raised some red flags. We had reason to believe—" "Raised red flags?" Colonel Mitchell's voice remained calm, but there was something in his tone that made Officer Walsh take a small step away from his partner. "What red flags? The fact that she's a 17-year-old black girl driving a nice car in this neighborhood?" "Now, wait just a minute," Rodriguez began, his face flushing red. "This has nothing to do with race. This is about a suspicious situation involving a potentially stolen vehicle." Colonel Mitchell reached into his pocket and produced his military identification, holding it at eye level for the officer to examine. "Colonel David Mitchell, United States Army Special Forces. That's my car. That's my daughter. And unless you can explain to me what law either of us has broken, this stops right now." Officer Walsh moved closer to examine the military ID, his expression showing the first signs of real concern about how this situation had developed. Rodriguez, however, seemed determined not to back down, even as the ground beneath his position crumbled. "Anyone can get fake military ID these days," Rodriguez said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried when he was addressing Zara. "And even if you are military, that doesn't give your daughter the right to—" "The right to what?" Colonel Mitchell's question came like a verbal slap. "The right to drive her father's car to and from her job at the community center? The right to exist in this neighborhood without being harassed? The right to be treated with the same respect you'd show any other citizen?" The colonel's words carried across the street clearly, and several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. The implication was clear to everyone present. This situation would have played out very differently if Zara had been a white teenager from the neighborhood. "Sir, we were just doing our job," Officer Walsh interjected, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. "We received reports of suspicious activity and—" "What reports?" Colonel Mitchell's attention turned to the younger officer like a laser. "Who reported suspicious activity? When? What specifically was reported as suspicious?" Officer Walsh looked to his partner for help, but Rodriguez was staring at the military ID with growing realization that his afternoon of entertainment was about to become a professional nightmare. "I want names," Colonel Mitchell continued. "I want to know who reported what suspicious activity involving my daughter driving my car from her job to our home. Because if no such reports exist, then what we have here isn't police work. It's harassment." Zara watched her father with a mixture of relief, pride, and amazement. She'd seen him in his military role before, but never like this, never using his full authority to protect her. The transformation in the crowd's behavior was remarkable. People who had been laughing at Officer Rodriguez's jokes about car theft and fake documents were now looking uncomfortable, some even moving away from the scene entirely. "Dad," Zara said quietly, "they said I stole your car. They said my college acceptance letters were fake. They said—" "I heard enough, Colonel." Mitchell cut her off gently, his voice softening when he spoke to her but hardening again as he turned back to the officers. "Officer Rodriguez, is it?" He read the name tag with deliberate precision. Let me tell you about my daughter, since you seem to have drawn some interesting conclusions about her character." The colonel moved to stand beside Zara, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. The simple gesture somehow made him seem even more imposing, like a shield wall that had formed around his child. Zara Johnson is a 17-year-old honor roll student at Jefferson High School. She maintains a 4.2 GPA while working part-time at the Riverside Community Center, where she tutors children in mathematics and reading. She has been accepted to Stanford University, Georgetown University, and the University of Colorado with partial scholarships to all three institutions. Each accomplishment landed like a hammer blow against the narrative Officer Rodriguez had been constructing. The crowd listened with increasing discomfort as the reality of what they had witnessed became undeniable. She volunteers at the local food bank every Saturday morning, Colonel Mitchell continued. She's been on the principal's honor roll for 6 consecutive semesters. She's never had so much as a detention, let alone any involvement with law enforcement, until today. Officer Rodriguez opened his mouth to respond, but the colonel wasn't finished. As for me, I've served this country for 22 years. I've done 4 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. I've been awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Army Commendation Medal. I currently serve as a training instructor for special operations candidates at Fort Carson, where I help prepare America's finest soldiers for the most dangerous missions our military undertakes. The weight of his credentials hung in the air like a challenge. Several people in the crowd had taken out their phones again, but now they were recording what appeared to be a very different story than the one they had started with. "So tell me, Officer Rodriguez," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had once commanded respect in some of the world's most dangerous places. "What exactly made my daughter suspicious enough to justify this public humiliation? What crime did she commit that warranted having her personal belongings dumped on the street like evidence at a crime scene?" The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Rodriguez looked around at the crowd, at his partner, at the scattered contents of Zara's backpack, and finally at the military ID still in his hand. For the first time since the stop began, he seemed to truly understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Sir," he began weakly, "we were just following standard procedures for—" "Standard procedures?" Colonel Mitchell's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his controlled demeanor. "Is it standard procedure to assume a young black woman is a criminal for driving a nice car? Is it standard procedure to ignore registration documents? Is it standard procedure to mock a citizen's claims about their family's military service?" The questions hung in the air like an indictment, and Officer Rodriguez had no answers that would make any of this look better. The standoff between Colonel Mitchell and Officer Rodriguez might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of a third police car. Sergeant Brooks, a 25-year veteran of the force, stepped out and immediately assessed the situation, with the keen eye of someone who had seen every type of police encounter imaginable. The crowd, the scattered belongings, the military officer in full uniform, and the uncomfortable body language of his fellow officers told him everything he needed to know. "What's the situation here?" Sergeant Brooks asked, directing his question to Officer Walsh rather than Rodriguez. Before Walsh could answer, Colonel Mitchell stepped forward. "Sergeant, I'm Colonel David Mitchell, U.S. Army Special Forces. Your officers have spent the last hour harassing my daughter, accusing her of stealing my car, and publicly humiliating her based on nothing more than their assumptions about who belongs in this neighborhood." Sergeant Brooks looked at the military ID that Colonel Mitchell handed him, then at Zara, then at the BMW's registration documents that Officer Walsh quickly provided. His expression grew increasingly grim as he pieced together what had transpired. "Officer Rodriguez," he said quietly, "step over here with me for a moment." The two officers moved away from the crowd, but their heated, whispered conversation was visible to everyone. Rodriguez gestured wildly, clearly trying to justify his actions, while Sergeant Brooks listened with growing disapproval. Meanwhile, Officer Walsh approached Colonel Mitchell with obvious nervousness. "Sir, I want to apologize for how this situation developed," Walsh began. "There were clearly some misunderstandings and—" "Misunderstandings?" Colonel Mitchell's voice remained controlled, but his eyes were steel. "Officer, let me be very clear about something. There was no misunderstanding here. Your partner saw a young black woman driving an expensive car and immediately assumed she was a criminal. Every piece of evidence that contradicted his assumption was dismissed or twisted to fit his predetermined narrative." The crowd listened intently as the colonel continued. "My daughter showed you her license and registration. The documents were legitimate. The car was legally registered to me. She explained her relationship to me and offered multiple times to have you contact me directly. At what point was any of this handled as a misunderstanding rather than harassment?" Officer Walsh had no answer. The facts were laid out clearly, and there was no way to reframe what had happened as anything other than what it was: racial profiling that had escalated into public humiliation. By now, several neighbors had approached to apologize to Zara and her father. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed the entire incident, was particularly upset about what she had seen. "I am so sorry, sweetheart," she said to Zara, her accent thick with emotion. "I have seen you drive that car many times. You are always so careful, so polite when you wave at us. This should never have happened to you." Mr. Thompson, the man who had been mowing his lawn when it all started, shook his head in disgust. "Colonel, I want you to know that not all of us were buying what that officer was selling. Some of us could see this was wrong from the beginning. But the apologies from neighbors, while appreciated, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. Videos of the incident were already spreading on social media, shared by multiple people who had recorded different parts of the encounter. The hashtag #JusticeForZara was beginning to trend locally, with people sharing their own stories of similar experiences. Sergeant Brooks returned from his conversation with Officer Rodriguez, his face grave. "Colonel Mitchell, I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. This incident does not represent the values of our department or the level of service our community deserves." "Apologies are a start," Colonel Mitchell replied, "but they're not enough. I want to know what concrete steps will be taken to ensure this doesn't happen to other families." "Sir, I can assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. Officer Rodriguez will be placed on administrative leave pending a full review. We take these matters very seriously." Zara, who had been quiet during most of her father's confrontation with the officers, finally spoke up. "What about all the other kids who don't have fathers like mine? What happens when this happens to someone whose parent can't command immediate respect? What happens to the families who don't have the privilege of military rank to protect them?" Her question silenced the crowd. Here was a 17-year-old girl who had just endured public humiliation, and her concern wasn't for herself, but for others who might face similar treatment without the protection she ultimately received. Colonel Mitchell looked at his daughter with obvious pride. "That's exactly the right question, Zara, and it's why this can't end with just an apology and one officer being disciplined. Over the following days, the incident gained widespread attention. The videos went viral, not just locally, but nationally. News stations picked up the story, and it became a talking point in discussions about police reform and racial justice. Colonel Mitchell found himself giving interviews, using his platform to advocate for systemic changes in law enforcement training and accountability. Zara, meanwhile, was invited to speak at a town hall meeting about police-community relations. Despite her initial nervousness about public speaking, she delivered a powerful address that focused on the human cost of racial profiling. "What happened to me wasn't just about me," she told the packed auditorium. "It was about every young person of color who has to live with the knowledge that they might be seen as suspicious simply for existing in certain spaces. It's about the psychological damage that comes from being treated like a criminal when you've done nothing wrong." Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and several community leaders approached her afterward about getting involved in local advocacy efforts. The police department, facing intense public scrutiny, implemented several reforms. They instituted mandatory bias training for all officers, established new protocols for traffic stops, and created a civilian oversight board to review complaints of misconduct. Officer Rodriguez, after completing an extensive retraining program and community service, publicly apologized and became an advocate for police accountability, a transformation that surprised many but demonstrated the potential for genuine change. 3 months later, Zara was featured in the local newspaper again, but this time for a very different reason. She had been awarded a full scholarship to Stanford University, and the article highlighted her academic achievements, community service, and her emerging role as a youth advocate for criminal justice reform. Colonel Mitchell framed the newspaper article and hung it in his office at Fort Carson, where it served as a reminder to the soldiers he trained about the importance of fighting for justice both abroad and at home. He often told them about his daughter's courage in turning a moment of injustice into an opportunity for positive change. Zara decided to major in criminal justice with a minor in public policy, determined to work within the system to create the changes she wanted to see. She continued her volunteer work at the community center, but also began mentoring other young people who had experienced interactions with law enforcement. The BMW that had been at the center of the controversy became something of a symbol in their household. Colonel Mitchell continued to let Zara drive it, but now their neighbors waved more enthusiastically when they saw her behind the wheel. Mrs. Chen often invited her over for tea, and Mr. Thompson always stopped his yard work to chat when she drove by. One evening, as Zara was driving home from a student government meeting at her high school, she noticed a young Latino boy being questioned by police in the parking lot of a grocery store. Without hesitation, she pulled over and got out of her car. "Excuse me?" she said politely to the officers. "Is everything okay here?" The presence of a well-dressed young woman in an expensive car, asking questions with the confidence of someone who expected to be heard, immediately changed the dynamic of the situation. The officers explained that they were investigating reports of shoplifting, but when Zara asked specific questions about what evidence they had and whether the young man had been read his rights, it became clear that their stop was based on the same kind of assumptions that had led to her own harassment. Within minutes, the situation was resolved with apologies from the officers and no charges filed. The young man, grateful but confused about why a stranger had intervened on his behalf, listened as Zara explained her own experience and gave him her contact information in case he ever needed someone to advocate for him. As she drove home that evening, Zara realized that her father's intervention had done more than just rescue her from an unjust situation. It had shown her the power of using privilege and position to protect others, and it had taught her that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for yourself, but for the people who come after you. The incident that had started as a humiliating encounter with police bias had transformed into a lesson about courage, advocacy, and the responsibility that comes with having a voice that others will hear. And as Zara pulled into her driveway that night, she knew that this was just the beginning of her lifelong commitment to ensuring that no other young person would have to endure what she had experienced on that afternoon on Maple Street.